There are encounters that change a life forever. There are farewells that leave wounds that never heal. And there are stories of loyalty that leave us speechless. Is there any love in this world purer than the love of a dog? Today, Dog Stories takes you on an emotional journey, a story about a dog abandoned at an airport, a boy with a warm heart, and one final choice that changes everything. Are you ready? Hit the subscribe button now and join us as we unfold this touching story, because sometimes family isn't where we're born, but where someone is truly waiting for us to return. Now let's dive into the story. The airport was bustling and crowded. People hurried back and forth, announcements echoed through the terminal, and luggage wheels rolled smoothly across the polished floor. Amid the rushing travelers, a middle-aged man in a long coat walked, briskly, his expression cold and unwavering. Beside him, a German shepherd named Bruno quietly followed, his tail wagging slightly. Bruno looked up at his owner, his eyes full of trust. He didn't understand why they had come to this unfamiliar place today, but it didn't matter. As long as Mr. Thomas was by his side, anywhere could be home. When they reached a quiet corner near the entrance, Thomas suddenly stopped. Instinctively, Bruno sat down, ears perked, waiting for a command. The man crouched down, his hand brushing lightly over the dog's soft fur. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he quickly stood up, unhooked the leash, and looped it around a nearby metal post. Bruno blinked, tilting his head in confusion. This was the first time Thomas had ever tied him up like this. He let out a soft whimper, lifting one paw slightly as if to ask, "What's going on?" But Thomas didn't answer. He took a step back, then another. And before Bruno could understand what was happening, he turned around and walked away. Bruno immediately got up, tugging lightly at the leash, only to feel the pull keeping him in place. He let out a small bark, not too loud, just enough to remind his owner that he had forgotten something. Thomas didn't turn back. Bruno barked again, louder this time. Once, twice. But the man kept walking, disappearing into the sea of travelers, never looking back. Bruno yanked at the leash, his paws scratching desperately against the polished tile floor. He didn't understand. Where was his owner going? Why wasn't he taking him along? Time passed, second by second, minute by minute. Bruno sat still, his eyes fixed on the spot where Thomas had disappeared. Any moment now, his owner could return. Any moment. But he didn't. In the distance, the airport speakers crackled with an announcement. A flight was about to depart. Through the glass windows, Bruno saw a plane taxiing down the runway, preparing for takeoff. Instinct kicked in. Thomas could be on that plane. Without hesitation, Bruno sprang up, yanking hard at the leash. The sudden force tightened it around his neck, but he didn't care. He bit down on it, pulling with all his strength. Once, twice, and then, snap, freedom. The roar of the plane's engines filled the air, shaking the ground beneath him. In the crowded terminal, hundreds of passengers focused on their upcoming flights, unaware of a lone dog sprinting with everything he had across the cold concrete. Bruno bolted like the wind, every powerful stride fueled by sheer panic and desperation. His burning brown eyes locked onto the massive plane ahead, now accelerating down the runway, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. He ran despite his breath, growing heavier. He ran despite the searing pain in his paws from the rough pavement. He had to catch up. He had to make Thomas turn around. The wind whipped against his face, but nothing could stop him. His tail lowered, muscles tensed, every step radiating pure determination. He barked, a sharp, desperate cry, but the deafening roar of the jet engines swallowed his voice whole. The plane's wheels lifted off the ground. Bruno pushed harder, his powerful legs driving him forward as if he could launch himself into the sky. Dust and wind stung his eyes, but he refused to blink. He had to see Thomas. Sirens blared in the distance. Airport security had spotted a stray dog rushing into the restricted zone, but before they could react, Bruno surged forward with one final burst of speed. The gap between him and the plane grew wider. His heart pounded, breath ragged. One thought consumed his mind. Don't go. With everything he had left, he leaped, as if he could somehow grasp onto the fading trail of exhaust. But there was nothing. Only empty air. The plane was beyond his reach. His strength gave out. Bruno stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him, his paws skidding across the runway. He tumbled, rolling several times before coming to a stop, his body trembling from exhaustion. His breaths came in sharp, labored gasps, his chest rising and falling rapidly. But his eyes never left the sky. The wind swept across the open tarmac, lifting a thin veil of dust. The golden sunlight reflected in his weary gaze. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye. The plane was gone. Bruno lay motionless, his body drained, his heart hollow. He had given everything, every ounce of strength, to chase the impossible. But in the end, he couldn't catch up. Up in the sky, the aircraft shrank into a tiny dot, before vanishing beyond the endless layers of white clouds. Silently, Bruno lowered his head onto the cold concrete, his eyes still locked onto the sky. Thomas was gone, and Bruno's world had never felt lonelier. Bruno remained still on the runway, his gaze fixed on the vast sky where the plane had long since disappeared. His breathing gradually steadied, but the weight in his chest remained unbearable. A uniformed airport security officer approached cautiously, his steps hesitant. He muttered under his breath, "Where did this dog come from?" Then he crouched, down to get a closer look. Bruno didn't move. He didn't react. He didn't care about the man standing over him. He didn't care about anything, except one thing. Thomas would come back. When the officer gently patted his back to check on him, Bruno flinched slightly but made no attempt to resist. His sorrowful brown eyes remained fixed on the arrival gate, silently waiting. After a moment, seeing that Bruno posed no threat, the man sighed, shook his head, and walked away. The sun began to set behind the airport terminals, casting a warm orange glow over the vast runway. Bruno remained where he was, right at the exit of the arrivals area. Hundreds of passengers stepped off their flights, pulling their luggage, chatting animatedly. But Bruno didn't care about them. Each time the automatic doors slid open, he perked up slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. But as one traveler after another walked past without recognition, his head slowly lowered again, disappointed, but still waiting. This flight didn't have Thomas. Maybe the next one would. And so, he waited. Night fell and the airport grew quieter. Under the dim yellow lights, Bruno curled up near the exit, silently watching the last few passengers of the day trickle out. A cold breeze swept through the terminal, making his fur bristle. Just days ago, Bruno had a warm place to sleep, beside the man he loved. But now there was no soft bed, no familiar footsteps, no gentle hand ruffling his fur at the end of the day. He tucked his head between his front paws, trying to make himself smaller against the chill. But the cold didn't just come from the night air, it came from the emptiness inside him. In the distance, a cleaning staff member swept the floor near the entrance. She spotted Bruno, hesitated for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a leftover sandwich. Gently, she placed it on the ground. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said softly. Bruno looked up, his eyes quiet and unreadable. But he didn't touch the food. He wasn't hungry. Or maybe, the ache in his heart had drowned out the hunger in his stomach. The woman sighed, shook her head, and continued with her work. Bruno remained still, his gaze fixed on the airport exit, because at any moment Thomas might return. Day after day. The endless cycle as the sun rose higher, the airport buzzed back to life, once again crowded with travelers. Bruno stretched his stiff body, exhaustion weighing on him. But no matter how tired he was, today was a new day, another chance for Thomas to come back. And so, he kept waiting. Passengers stepped off the planes, walking past Bruno as if he were just another invisible fixture of the airport. He watched each person carefully, searching for a familiar face among the crowd. But they were all strangers. Over time, airport staff began to notice his presence. Some felt sorry for him and occasionally left small bits of food or a bowl of water nearby. But Bruno rarely ate. Sometimes he would sniff at it, then lower his head and continue waiting. His patience was heartbreaking to witness. Day turned to night. Bruno kept his routine, choosing a spot near the exit, his eyes never straying from the steady stream of people coming and going. By now, he had grown used to the cold, used to being alone, used to the curious glances of passing travelers. But there was one thing he could never get used to. Thomas still hadn't come back. A fading hope. The second day passed, then the third, then the fourth. Bruno never left the airport, not even once. Planes continued to land. Thousands of people continued to leave, but none of them were Thomas. And so, Bruno kept waiting, yet with vow. Each passing day, the light in his eyes dimmed little by little. At first, every time the doors opened, he would spring up, filled with hope. But then, disappointment. Each time it wasn't Thomas, he would lie back down, sinking deeper into heartbreak. He was still patient, but doubt was creeping in. Was Thomas really coming back, or was he waiting for something that would never happen? But no matter how much the uncertainty grew, Bruno couldn't leave. He had to wait, because waiting was the only thing he knew how to do. As time passed, the endless days at the airport began leaving visible marks on Bruno's body. At first, he still had the strength to sit and wait, his eyes lighting up with hope every time a plane landed. But as the days dragged on, his body began to weaken. His steps grew heavier, his legs trembled from exhaustion, the meals became fewer. In the beginning, airport staff would sometimes leave small portions of food near his usual spot. Bruno would take a few bites, just enough to keep going, before turning his gaze back, toward the arrivals gate. But eventually, even those small meals became rare, and Bruno no longer felt hunger. Or maybe, he simply no longer cared to eat. The once lean, strong body had shrunk. His once glossy coat had turned dull and patchy, with clumps of fur falling away to reveal dry, fragile skin beneath. The deep brown eyes that once shone with life were now hollow, empty, filled only with quiet despair. Each night, under the dim, yellow lights of the airport, Bruno looked like nothing more than a thin, fragile shadow against the vast open space. He still lay in the same spot, but gone was the eager posture of a dog waiting in hope. Now, all he could do was curl up tightly, bracing himself against the bitter cold. Winter rains began to arrive. Some nights, the rain poured endlessly, drenching the airport in a cold, damp mist. Bruno had nowhere to seek shelter. He just lay there, letting the rain soak into his already matted fur, letting the cold seep deep into his bones. Every morning after the rain stopped, he remained motionless, shivering, weak. There were times he tried to stand, but his frail legs no longer had the strength to hold him up. He would collapse where he stood, too exhausted to try again. Bruno's presence had become a familiar sight to the airport staff. Some pitied him. Some wished they could help, but no one could take him away, because Bruno wouldn't leave. He didn't want to. He only wanted to wait, to cling to the fragile hope that one day Thomas would return. But no matter how strong the will, the body has its limits. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Bruno struggled to stand as he did every day, but this time his legs refused to obey. He staggered forward a few steps, then collapsed onto the cold ground. People nearby paused, their eyes filled with concern. But Bruno didn't notice. He didn't feel anything anymore. His body was fading, little by little, day by day. The crowd rushed in and out of the airport, too busy to notice the frail figure lying silently near the entrance. Bruno remained motionless, his eyes half open, his breathing weak. He was too exhausted to lift his head. All he could do was wait, quietly, hopelessly, but someone did notice him. Not far away, a 9-year-old boy stood beside his mother, clutching a small backpack tightly. His name was Jack, and he lived in a neighborhood near the airport. Today, his mother had brought him here to pick up his father from a business trip, but while she kept her eyes on the passengers stepping off the plane, Jack was looking somewhere else. His gaze was fixed on a lonely dog lying motionless on the cold tile floor. Jack frowned. He had seen this dog before. Jack wasn't the kind of kid who overlooked things. Every time his mother brought him to the airport, he noticed Bruno, a big dog with thick fur and sad eyes. At first, Jack thought Bruno must belong to someone. But then, he realized something. Every time he came here, the dog was always in the same place, in the same position, waiting. Today, Bruno looked worse than ever. His body was painfully thin, his fur matted and dirty. Even as people walked past, he didn't move. Jack felt a sharp pain in his chest. Something was wrong. He tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, what's wrong with that dog?" His mother glanced over briefly, then shook her head. "It's probably just a stray, sweetie. Don't go near it." Jack didn't believe that. No stray dog looked at people with eyes so full of longing. When he saw that his mother was distracted, Jack quietly stepped toward Bruno. He crouched down, gently reaching out a hand. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Bruno barely stirred, his ears twitching slightly, but he gave no other response. Jack swallowed hard. "Are you hungry?" There was no response. Jack rummaged through his backpack and pulled out a sandwich his mom had packed for him. He unwrapped it, tore off a small piece, and placed it in front of Bruno. Bruno caught the scent of food, but he didn't move. Jack felt a pang of disappointment. He knew dogs loved to eat, but this one, he had never seen a dog refuse food before. "You're really sad, aren't you?" Jack whispered. He didn't know what Bruno had been through, but he could feel the pain in his eyes. No dog would lie there, silent and still, in the middle of a crowded place, unless it was waiting for someone. Jack sat there for a while, not rushing to leave. He didn't try to pet Bruno, didn't force him to eat. He just stayed. When his mother called for him, Jack hesitated before standing up. But before leaving, he gently placed the rest of his sandwich near Bruno. "I'll come back tomorrow, okay?" He ran toward his mother, but before going too far, he glanced back. Bruno still hadn't touched the food, but for the first time, his dull, lifeless eyes shifted, quietly following the small figure disappearing into the crowd. Maybe, deep within his fading heart, Bruno had felt something, just a tiny flicker of warmth in his endless loneliness. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, rolling toward the airport like a storm brewing on the horizon. The wind howled stronger than usual, carrying a sharp, chilling mist. Jack sat by his bedroom window, staring out at the darkening sky. From a distance, he could hear the deep rumble of thunder. A storm was coming. He bit his lip, anxiety twisting in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about Bruno. Ever since he met that dog, the image of him, frail, curled up outside the airport, had been burned into his mind. Jack had promised to return, but the heavy rain would keep him inside tonight. His mother would never let him go out in this weather. But what if he didn't go? Bruno would still be there, alone, trapped under the freezing downpour, with no shelter, no one to protect him. Jack pictured him trembling in the rain, his empty eyes staring into nothingness. The thought made Jack's chest tighten painfully. He couldn't wait any longer. He rushed to his closet, grabbing the thickest jacket he owned. Then he dug through his desk drawer, pulling out a small flashlight. He knew sneaking out in the middle of a storm would get him in trouble. His mother would be furious, but that didn't matter anymore. Bruno needed him. Jack quietly opened his window, climbed onto the ledge, and carefully lowered himself onto the roof overhang. Then, with a deep breath, he jumped. The icy rain lashed against his face the moment his feet hit the ground, but he didn't hesitate. He took off running toward the airport. By the time Jack arrived, the rain had grown heavier. The airport lights still glowed brightly, but the parking lot nearby was deserted. No one wanted to be outside in this weather. Jack's heart pounded as he scanned the area, and then he saw him. Bruno was still there, in the exact same spot, his body drenched from head to toe. He didn't move. He didn't even lift his head. Only the slight twitch of his ears signaled that he was still breathing as Jack approached. The boy dropped too, his knees, rain streaming down his face, his breath shaky from the cold. "Bruno," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog didn't respond. Jack peeled off his jacket and carefully draped it over Bruno's soaked body, hoping to offer him even the smallest bit of warmth. But he knew it wasn't enough. Bruno was too weak. Leaning in closer, Jack pressed his lips near Bruno's ear and whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore, Bruno. I'm here. I'm staying with you." Somehow those quiet words cut through the relentless downpour. For the first time, something flickered in Bruno's tired eyes. Jack didn't care that his own clothes were drenched, that he was shivering from the cold. He simply wrapped his arms around Bruno, holding him close, comforting him with nothing but warmth and love. The rain continued to fall, but in that moment, something else had formed between them. An unspoken bond, a silent promise. Love. Trust. Jack closed his eyes and held Bruno even tighter because he had made his decision. No matter what happened from now on, he was never leaving Bruno's side. Early the next morning, as the first rays of sunlight peeked through after the night's rain, Jack slowly opened his eyes. His shoulders were freezing, but the warmth radiating from Bruno's body made him feel safe. Bruno was already awake. He was no longer lying motionless like the night before. The presence of someone beside him through the night had stirred something deep within him, a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Jack shifted slightly, a soft smile forming on his lips. When he realized Bruno was looking at him, "Good morning, buddy." Bruno didn't bark, but something in his eyes had changed. They were no longer completely empty. When Jack reached out his hand, this time, instead of turning away like before, Bruno gently pressed his nose against Jack's palm. Jack laughed. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first sign that Bruno was beginning to trust him. The early days of their bond, from that day on, Jack came to see Bruno every single day. Even with school keeping him busy, he always made time to run to the airport after class. At first, Bruno still kept his distance, but he no longer avoided Jack. Every day, Jack brought food, sometimes a sandwich, sometimes a bit of meat his mom had set aside. Slowly, Bruno started eating more, and each time he did, Jack felt a quiet joy blooming in his heart. But Jack didn't just come to feed him. He stayed. He stays. Sat beside Bruno, talking to him like an old friend. He told him about his day at school, about the difficult assignments he didn't like, about the times his classmates teased him, and even about the dreams he held deep inside. Bruno didn't understand every word, but he listened. He liked the soft, gentle voice. He liked that Jack always showed up, bringing a smile and a warmth Bruno had forgotten existed. Then one afternoon, as Jack rambled on about his day, Bruno suddenly leaned forward and gave his hand a small, unexpected lick. A bond begins to form. Jack froze. He stared at his small hand, then looked up at Bruno, his eyes wide with surprise. "Did you just kiss me?" Bruno wagged his tail. For the first time, Jack burst into laughter, the pure, joyful sound echoing across the empty lot. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around Bruno, and this time the dog didn't pull away. At last, two lost souls had found each other. Over time, Jack and Bruno became a familiar sight at the airport. The staff no longer saw Bruno as just another hopeless stray. They saw the way Jack cared for him, the way the two friends played together every afternoon. Jack was no longer just a boy who passed by out of curiosity. He had become the only family Bruno had left. A new beginning. Some days Jack would bring a small ball trying to teach Bruno how to play. At first, Bruno showed no interest, but over time, something changed. When Jack threw the ball, Bruno's tail started to wag. Then one day, when the ball rolled a little too far, Bruno stood up. Slowly, carefully, he took a few hesitant steps forward, then picked up the ball in his mouth and turned back toward Jack. Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. "You did it." Laughing, he threw his arms around Bruno, patting his back the way one would praise a friend. And once again, Bruno wagged his tail. He didn't have to say anything. Bruno understood now. Jack would never abandon him. Jack was the first person in the world to give Bruno a reason to trust again. One day, 1 week, 1 month passed. Bruno was no longer the motionless dog curled up in a corner. He stood up more. walked more, and for the first time, he began to realize, no matter how cruel the world had been, there would always be a small hand reaching out, waiting for him to take it. And finally, Bruno chose to reach back. The day everything changed. The sky was clear that day, the airport as bustling as ever. Jack and Bruno sat in their usual spot, the one where they always waited, watching planes land. But today felt different. Jack had just heard something from an airport employee. Thomas had come back. Jack froze at the mention of that name. His emotions tangled in a way he couldn't quite explain. Part of him felt nervous. Part of him felt something else. An unfamiliar flicker of anger. And Bruno? Jack turned to look at him. Bruno lay quietly beside him, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Did he still remember that man? How would he react if he saw him again? Jack clenched his fists, then slowly reached out, gently stroking Bruno's head. Let's wait together, okay? The reunion, the plane landed. Passengers began pouring out of the airport gates, dragging heavy suitcases behind them. Jack held his breath, scanning the crowd. And then, he saw him, a tall, lean man in a gray coat. Thomas. His face hadn't changed much. The same sharp eyes. The same steady walk. He stepped past the terminal doors, his gaze skimming over the sea of unfamiliar faces. Until his eyes stopped. Just a few meters away, Bruno sat still. Jack felt Bruno's body tense up beside him. The dog didn't bark, he didn't wag his tail, he just sat there completely motionless, his deep brown eyes locked onto the man standing before him. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his expression flickering with something almost like hesitation. Maybe he hadn't expected to see Bruno here, still waiting, in the exact place he had been left behind months ago. Slowly, Thomas took a step forward. Bruno. Bruno didn't move. Jack saw Thomas extend his hand slightly, a silent invitation. But Bruno didn't respond. He simply stared. No excitement. No wagging tail. The joy that should have been there wasn't. Maybe time had changed something inside. Thomas knelt down, his voice quieter now. I came back to take you home. Jack's chest tightened. A wave of fear swept over him. Would Bruno choose to leave? Jack clenched his fists but didn't say a word. This wasn't his decision to make. Bruno remained silent. He didn't leap forward in excitement. He didn't rush into Thomas's arms like a loyal dog reunited with its long-lost owner. Instead, he just sat there, still, calm, unreadable. His deep brown eyes lingered on Thomas, as if trying to recognize the man who had once meant everything to him. But time had not erased the truth. The endless waiting, the cold, lonely nights, the hunger, the exhaustion, the slow fading of hope. All of it was still there, etched into Bruno's heart. But now, he was no longer alone. He had Jack. Bruno turned his head, looking back at the boy who had never left him behind. Jack met his gaze, his expression soft but unwavering. Jack wasn't going to make the decision for him. If Bruno chose to leave, he wouldn't stop him. The air between them grew thick with silence. Then, slowly, Bruno stood up. Jack held his breath. Bruno took a step forward, but not toward Thomas. He walked straight to Jack. Then, he sat down beside him, pressing his head gently against the boy's arm. A silent, undeniable choice. Thomas watched. In silence, his emotions tangled in a way he hadn't expected. The dog he had abandoned had found someone new, someone who would never abandon him in return. But Thomas couldn't just walk away empty-handed. He crouched down and patted Bruno's back. You've taken good care of him, he said to Jack, his voice calm but laced with hesitation. Jack nodded immediately. I promise I'll always be with Bruno. Thomas pressed his lips together as if he were grappling with something deep inside. Then, without warning, he straightened up, his grip tightening around the leash in his hand. But I still have to take him. Jack froze. What do you mean? Before Jack could fully process his words, Thomas gave the leash a firm tug, signaling for Bruno to stand. Panic shot through Jack like a bolt of lightning. He rushed forward, stepping protectively in front of Bruno, arms spread wide, his small frame shaking. "No, you can't do this. I'm the one who's been taking care of him all this time." Thomas locked eyes with him, his expression no longer cold but still unshakably firm. "He's my dog," he said, voice low and steady. "And I came back to take him home." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His throat tightened, his heart pounded, and for the first time fear truly set in. Despite Thomas holding the leash firmly, Bruno didn't move like he once would. His paws stayed planted against the cold tile floor, his gaze no longer fixed on the man who had once been his owner. Instead, he turned his head, looking back. Looking at Jack, who stood behind him, his eyes red, desperately holding back tears. "Come on, Bruno." Thomas gave the leash a gentle pull, but Bruno only lowered his head, letting out a soft whimper. Jack clenched his lips together, trying his hardest not to cry. He didn't want Bruno to see his pain, didn't want to make this harder on him. If Bruno truly belonged with Thomas, Jack wouldn't try to stop him, but that didn't mean his heart wouldn't shatter. Thomas looked down at Bruno, then back at Jack. Jack said nothing, but his eyes said everything. The airport buzzed around them, travelers rushing past, oblivious to the silent struggle unfolding. The speakers overhead crackled, announcing the final boarding call. Time was running out. Thomas let out a quiet sigh, then crouched down, patting Bruno's back. "Let's go home." Bruno still didn't move. Finally, Thomas decided he couldn't wait any longer. He bent down and lifted Bruno into his arms. Bruno squirmed slightly, but he didn't bite or fight back. Still, his entire body was tense, his eyes never leaving Jack. Jack bit his lip, his hands trembling as he watched his best friend being taken away. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but the emptiness in his chest remained. All he could do was stand there, watching as Thomas carried Bruno toward the boarding gate, further and further away. Bruno kept looking back, even as they reached the jet bridge, even as the distance between them grew. Then, just as Thomas reached the plane's entrance, Bruno suddenly began to struggle. His body jerked, his muscles tensed, and his eyes filled with panic. He twisted in Thomas's arms, his head snapping back, desperately searching the crowd. Thomas felt the sudden resistance and furrowed his brows, pausing at the foot of the plane's stairs. Bruno wasn't looking forward. He was still looking for Jack. Thomas let out a quiet sigh. He tightened his grip on the leash, but this time he didn't pull. Instead, he looked down at Bruno, then back toward the boy standing silently in the distance. He had never seen Bruno like this before. He wasn't struggling out of fear. He wasn't resisting out of defiance. He simply didn't want to leave Jack. And in that moment, Thomas finally understood what he had failed to see all along. Bruno was no longer his. He had found someone else, someone who truly loved him, someone who would never abandon him. That boy was now Bruno's family. Thomas took a deep breath, then knelt down and unfastened the leash. "Go." His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it trembled ever so slightly. Without a moment's hesitation, Bruno leaped down and sprinted toward Jack. Jack's eyes widened, barely able to react before Bruno crashed into him, tail wagging wildly, pressing his head against the boy's chest as if afraid he might disappear. Jack wrapped his arms around Bruno, holding him tight as tears finally spilled from his eyes. But this time, they were tears of happiness. From a distance, Thomas watched them, a faint smile touching his lips. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and stepped onto the plane. This time, Bruno didn't look back, because he finally knew where he truly belonged. The days that followed. After everything, Bruno stayed with Jack. No more lonely days spent waiting. No more cold, rainy nights soaking through his fur. No more desperate eyes watching every plane, hoping for someone who would never return. Now, every morning when Jack woke up, the first thing he saw was Bruno curled up beside his bed, breathing softly, peacefully. And every time Jack stepped outside, Bruno was right there beside him, walking in perfect stride, as if afraid that even a single moment of carelessness might make Jack disappear. The two spent their days together, running in the yard, playing fetch, strolling through the neighborhood. Bruno was no longer a dog who waited in silence. He barked when he was happy. He jumped with excitement when Jack brought him food, and every night he would rest his head against Jack, soaking in the warmth he had once lost for so long. At last, he had found his home. Bruno was once an abandoned dog, alone in the middle of a crowded airport, patiently waiting for an owner who would never return. But thanks to the love and determination of one boy, Bruno finally found his true home, a place where he wasn't just cared for, but loved unconditionally. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's a story about friendship, loyalty, and forgiveness. Because sometimes, family isn't where we're born, but where we find real love. And you know what? There are still many dogs out there, just like Bruno, waiting for someone to open their hearts and give them a second chance. If you believe that every dog deserves a loving home, leave a faw in the comments. What do you think about Thomas's final decision? If it were you, would you have done the same? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget, Dog Stories isn't just a storytelling channel. It's a place where animal lovers come together to spread kindness, warmth, and love. Hit that subscribe button today so you won't miss our next heartwarming story. We truly appreciate every bit of your support. Let's spread love for our four-legged friends even further. Thank you for listening to this story. See you next time for another touching journey.